Hello, my name is Joseph Shetta. The title of my talk is The Sympathetic Magic of Settler Colonialism, the Deliquescence, Ingestion, and Replacement of the Native in the Americas. My name is Joseph Shetta. I have a educational history, mostly from Chicago. And then following that, I was at the UW-Madison in the veterinary school doing research, where I briefly applied and was accepted into the School of Nursing. Then spent several years as a bench biotechnician and small animal surgeon. Then I went through a small stint of teaching at tribal high schools in South Dakota, and then went for a master's of pharmacogenomics at the UW-Seattle. I'm currently at Johns Hopkins finishing a DRPH in public health in environmental health sciences and engineering. I am also the senior researcher at the Native Biodata Consortium on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. My wife and kids are enrolled on the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation in South Dakota, but I myself am indigenous to Mexico. I have several bloodlines in my ancestry from Mexico, but the confirmed tribal affiliations that I know about from my family and also confirmed in the state of Michoacan are the Purepecha, otherwise known as Tarascan, meaning we like to visit, and the Raramuri or the Tarahumara from Chihuahua in Copper Canyon, and they're also called the Tarahumara, or the ones that run. I was trained by Ken Thummel at the Department of Pharmaceutics at the UW-Seattle, and also jointly with the head of Bioethics and Humanities, Dr. Wiley Burke. And she said many times we shouldn't focus on building up trust in vulnerable populations like tribal nations. Rather, we should make public funders and university researchers more trustworthy. There's a lot of things that can be done better in precision health and precision medicine. And Dr. Ruha Benjamin, in several papers, has argued that there's a lot of data that either has not been collected and amended for non-white populations, or it has been collected, it just hasn't been applied to third world countries or vulnerable populations here in the US. Some of those things that could be used by the current technologies of genomics and big data are making sure that recommended daily allowances for various supplementation in people of dark skin are reevaluated and adjusted for darker skinned people and other ethnicities. For instance, the folate, iron, and vitamin D all seem to have different biological requirements for Native people, especially in the US and Canada. This is a few sections from a paper that I wrote with some colleagues in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, and also a similar paper for biomedicine. And it says, we must reconcile the widening disparity between practicing science upon Indigenous peoples and transforming science with us. Indigenous people can no longer be passive participants in science. We wish to elevate attention to Indigenous data sovereignties commensurate with science's past exploitation and possibly even current exploitation of Indigenous genomes. Indigenous peoples have sovereignty over their data. Federal funding agencies and universities must stop feigning ignorance over this fact. I coined this saying that inventory is the foundation of sovereignty. So a lot of Indigenous people do not want to own the land that they walk on, or even own the natural products within their purview, but they do acknowledge that attribution and origination of some crops and ideas come from within their boundaries and histories of their people. So rather than calling it ownership in this slide, I'm calling it inventory, and then categorization for its use is tribal prerogative. And there's been a lot of things taken from the Americas before tribes could do anything about it. Of course, a lot of them you know already, like corn or maize, sunflower seed and sunflower oil, cotton. Believe it or not, most of the world's cotton is a hybrid of American and Egyptian cotton, with the majority of the genetics coming from American cotton. And then there's all the different quinones that come from the cinchona tree in South America. Pineapples come from the Caribbean and South America. And of course, the more well-known targets of colonization of gold and oil. And currently, we're seeing a lot of appropriation and theft of Native American artifacts and ceremonies. The most recent takings, of course, are DNA. It's an ongoing debate that started with the Human Genome Diversity Project back in the 90s, and is a current debate raging not just in the Americas, but any indigenous space around the world. And then Taxol, which came from historic and anthropological investigations in the Pacific Northwest, led to the biomedical investigations of the inner bark of the Pacific yew tree, and produced this blockbuster chemotherapeutic, which has resulted in many other similar chemotherapeutics since then. And for none of these products, including chocolate, beans, pumpkins, tobacco, and a ton of others, Native Americans have not received compensation. In addition, people in the Americas are not allowed to travel freely among European colonial borders. Of course, we hear a lot about Central American and Mexican immigration, and we're even seeing some restriction of the Jay Treaty across the Canadian-US boundary for increasingly pejorative reasons. So we're not a nation of immigrants. There is, the last total is about 11 million between the US and Canada. And then if you count the official number and 45 million indigenous people in Latin America, that's already 56 million. But it's probably closer to 300 million because some countries don't count accurately their indigenous people in Latin America. We hear this all the time. They want our culture, they want our food, now they want our DNA, but not our struggle. And really, Indian country in the United States is a weird and twisted target for white supremacy. We had back in the Oklahoma era, when many tribes were forcibly and tragically removed to Oklahoma, there was a lot of corruption in the federal Indian agency programs, where white settlers were given land that wasn't theirs, somehow finagled or swindled tribes out of their land, or simply became Indians by paying an Indian agent for a certificate of Indian birth. Of course, they name a lot of places and military equipment after native tribes, which is a little bit weird, in my opinion, to honor what is basically your enemy, an enemy that's still alive and still fighting for their freedom. Also, there are many churches that do a lot of missionizing and also create some pejorative narratives about being Native American. Right now, with fracking, because of the fractionated jurisdiction of many reservations, different types of federal regulation like OSHA standards and EPA standards are circumvented by illegally dumping or illegally having businesses on reservations that cause a lot of harm to Native people. And then we have a lot of pretendians in the mix there, claiming to speak for Native people when they don't. In the last or before the last administration of the Trump administration, there was a lot of alt-right narratives taking place, like this book, The Trail of New Tears, which basically said that the US government and its trust system for reservations was the reason for Native American poverty, which isn't exactly true. It's a lot more complicated and that removing or terminating that trust responsibility over tribes was going to fix it, and that's not exactly true. It would probably result much like what the Dawes Act did and was the basis for the Cobell-Salazar lawsuit, where the United States would have abrogated its protective responsibility over tribes, and there'd be a lot of charlatanism and otherwise stealing of native land. And there's a movie coming out right now by Martin Scorsese that talks about how that happened with the Osage Nation and the oil that was found under their nation. Also narratives about gun rights and weirdly applying that to tribal nations when the two systems of liberation or not liberation were imposed differently and are still imposed differently on Native American groups. And then most recently during COVID, we saw how Kristi Noem in the state of South Dakota tried to remove the coronavirus checkpoints on the Ogallala Sioux Reservation and the Cheyenne River Reservation unsuccessfully. And then we see increasingly more and more lawsuits targeted around the edges of sovereignty, and really grotesquely, in my opinion. So this fight against the Indian Child Welfare Act, known as ICWA, by big law firms, one of them a law firm that actually works with Walmart, might seem small to outsiders, but it's a very emotional and large issue to tribal governments and tribal people, that they protect their children and prevent them from going to non-Indian families. Otherwise, it would be a recapitulation of the boarding school era. But they are attacking this as a racial preference or a racial-based legislation, rather than seeing tribes as independent nations with the ability to protect their culture, land, language, people, and children. And they're attacking these smaller laws that protect tribal sovereignty because they want the bigger resources like rare earth minerals, oil, water, and of course, DNA from humans and plants. And in my view, federal departments that fund research have very slowly but inexorably created a system that silences researchers. And I think that was done on purpose, because after the detonation of the bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer and Einstein made it a point for the rest of their lives to go around lecturing against such uses of science and technology. And in this book, Oppenheimer is quoted as saying, "Science is not all of the life of reason, it is a part of it. Even the best of us knows how to do only very few things well, and what is available in the knowledge of fact, whether of science or of history, only the smallest of parts is in any of one man's knowing." He also says that the problem of the unity of knowledge and the problem of human solidarity are identical. Dialogue between diverse communities is essential. And this is a similar researcher who is a Polish Jew that escaped to Great Britain. And he also made similar comments about the use and the co-optation of science and technology for military and government purposes. And so he was sort of like the Carl Sagan of Great Britain, where he did a lot of science education on television, and he is quoted here by saying, "No science is immune to the infection of politics and the corruption of power." So you hear in a lot of circles that data is king. Well, data is not king, because data has to be interpreted through a filter or through many filters. Really, context is king. And what is missing for a lot of these conversations about genome or big data is that the local context, either through carefully research community opinions and anecdotes, or through indigenous academics and researchers, it's filtered through a very small subset of white researchers. So that begs the question then, since things have changed so much since the Belmont Report and the Common Rule were established, um, has the science landscape changed enough? And does that mean that scientists have a different accountability? And what should they do about it? So we have a lot of different changes. We have massive disruptive technologies, of course, the internet, high-speed computing, um, genomic and omics technologies in general, um, facial recognition software, tons and tons of new disruptive technologies. And some of that gets funneled into the idea of democratizing science, but democratizing science, of course, like everything in democracy, is central tendency and really leaves out input or control from those populations in the tails. Global corporations, growing more monopolies just camouflaged as uh, other types of business entities that are still linked to the main corporation, growing partisanship around the world with the alt-right takeover of many governments that we've seen in the last 6 to 7 years, growing disparities on economy, health, and political voice, a sharp decrease, at least in the United States, a sharp decrease in privacy and ethics. So that means hypothetically that a lot of power rests with scientists and technicians. Scientists and technicians can start moving into fields of political leadership, corporate ownership, and then enforcing their science and moral opinions on policy and legal committees. Data is the next big tribal issue. Indeed, it's the next big issue for everyone. Alondra Nelson last summer put out a paper calling for an artificial intelligence bill of rights, recognizing that everybody's data is going to be up for grabs. And of course, companies like Microsoft, Google, and Facebook, in addition to their data scouring techniques on the internet, also have biomedical and agricultural arms of their operations. And this graph is a little bit off. It's a little bit old, actually. So 26 billion market in 2018, which is more likely going to be 70 to 80 billion in 2025. And we know that data has been thought about in these terms about manipulating public opinion and world events for quite a while. It's been talked about in science fiction, most notably in the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov, where we can use mathematical modeling to shape economies, politics, and behavior over time. And then indeed, we see that a lot that's happening right now in real time. But what we haven't explained much to governments, politicians, tribal leaders, or the general public, especially during COVID, is that science is not, it's not magic. Science is not religion. Science is about prediction, and we cannot predict everything. There's a lot of uncertainty in science. Of course, there's a lot of technical uncertainty, and some examples are here, like allosterism in antibody-based tests, or whether or not those proteins or epitopes are the same presentation or visibility in different ethnic groups, and so whether or not the antibody actually works in those conditions. Process in science, meaning statistics, whether the data is big or small data. There's not a lot of statistics for small human population data, and the Bonferroni correction is always called into question. There's predictive uncertainty, in what cases and how many environments, how many layers would one person with a twin in two different parts of the world, identical genetics but different exposures, have the same outcomes. It's hard to tell. We are advancing with big data, but we haven't gotten to the point where we can look at these big questions layer by layer. Unanticipated uncertainty, like whether or not radioactive containment is going to perform the way we predicted it to, and whether or not things like climate change would pop up or get worse, as they seem to have in recent years. But out of all of this uncertainty, what is often forgotten is human failings and frailty, such as racism and greed. One example is tobacco, where we have known for quite a long time tobacco and nicotine is unhealthy for you. Those fights, some of them were won, but that did not get rid of the tobacco industry. That didn't get rid of people's use of tobacco, nor did it get rid of the possibility of repackaging tobacco and nicotine in new ways, like we see with e-cigarettes and other vaping products. Because in that particular instance, greed and racism is far too strong to have science and policy rule the day and make the changes that need to be made. And then another thing that's often forgotten, at least in genomics, is the ability of culture to change genomics. We saw it, of course, in the Amish. We might, with more investigation, have examples of it in Indigenous people. And one example is a book by Umberto Eco called The Dragon and the Unicorn, where it took European science historians and Chinese historians to look at the development of different technologies in China and Europe and their eventual uses. Two examples are boat building, the technological capability to build boats that travel over the oceans, and gunpowder. And we know, looking back on history, what happened there. One of the things that Native Americans are very afraid of is something like what happened to the 400 Amish in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who became a target because anti-cholesterol drugs like Repatha, focused on PCSK9, were partly discovered in northeastern German populations, and realizing that the Amish had come from an original founder population of German and Swiss people here in the Americas 325 years ago, that they might also harbor some new, or at least at high frequency variants that can create new blockbuster anti-cholesterol drugs. And indeed, that is what was found through a private and public partnership with Regeneron Pharmaceuticals and the University of Maryland in a remarkable quick pace. They found several variants that where they developed 3 drugs and brought them all to market in a whopping 2 years. That's really, really fast. One failed, 2 are likely to pass FDA. Both are likely to earn anywhere between $60 to $200 million a year for the next 10 years. And the Amish will get neither royalties or free drug. When asked why that was, a representative for Regeneron said that they had spoken to the lawyers and they decided that if they did that for the Amish, then they would have to do that for everyone, which is very scary because to remunerate 400 people is not a very big deal, and it should have been done, but of course it was not done. For Native Americans, if you compare it to the Amish, the Mennonites, Hutterites, and Church of the Brethren or Friends of God, we were here now, it's estimated at least by 25,000 years ago, with a Beringian pause in the bridge to the Americas anywhere between 40 and 35,000 years ago, with a estimated breeding population of about 70 people that populated the 250 million people that Columbus met when he first arrived in 1492. So a localized, small, bottleneck population burgeoning into a brand new hemisphere where humans had never been before, experiencing brand new animals, insects, and botanical life. as well as a north to south access rather than a east to west access, like most of the world is, or most of the human evolution is accustomed to. All of those things are going to make Native Americans likely a huge treasure chest of human variation that has never been seen before in the world. Part of the reason why this is a problem is that in 1980, the BiDole Act or BiDole Act helped solve some of the questions for publicly funded or publicly tax-based research and how it was divided. The economic interest was divided in the United States. It was a huge question whether or not the US government owned the data, whether or not universities owned the data, or the researcher. So the BiDole Act, by default, gives most of that ownership to the university and not the researcher and not the populations where the data comes from. This was further solidified in federal law HR 2272, also known as the America Competes Act, which took from 2007 to about 2014 to become finalized, which made a lot more ownership clear and also fit into the current era of open data and open access to all publicly collected data. And the idea of unregulated access to tribal or indigenous data is something that is objected to on its face because of the 530-year abuse and problematic history between the United States and tribal people. In this book by Shoshana Zuboff, she talks about companies like Facebook and Google, Microsoft, and others, and Apple, who collect a lot of data from the products that you use and then sell the data to different companies to surveil you for all kinds of reasons, including selling some of that information to Homeland Security and the military. And she talks about how these companies are creating patent plantations all over the world. If they do not feel like they're going to be successful in protecting their intellectual property here in the United States, they will lobby some third world country or some other country around the world to change their legislation so that they can move that intellectual property protection there and then claim it that way, or simply protect all of their intellectual property in every jurisdiction around the world. Again, going back to uncertainty in science, particularly for the bottom half of this slide, the next slides are relevant. So the human GDP, or the Human Genome Diversity Project, was started by Stanford and a few other entities, National Geographic as well, and that data is still out there. There was a considerable backlash to the HDP, although there's a few data sets from Canada and the US. Mostly those are not being used or otherwise protected in some way. But the ones that are not protected are mostly from Central and South America, and they become the reference information for these direct market companies, Ancestry, DNA 23, and many others. And it's a booming business. You can see here from this graph how much per year these companies are drawing down to tell customers whether or not they have Native American ancestry. So basically, without permission, tribal groups in the Americas and especially the United States are being exploited because many customers do not know or understand that these references are not based in the United States or Canada. They're based in Latin America, But the sexiness or the desire of customers is, of course, to be connected to the more popular either Plains tribes or Southwest tribes that people know about, so that they can entertain themselves or possibly claim some sort of benefits that they perceive tribes already get. And of course, it's a lot of money for these direct to market companies, even though a lot of the information that they might be giving is wholly inaccurate or wholly misunderstood. And we see this also with several adaptive traits, even though for the most part, humans share most of their human genome diversity with the rest of the planet. There are instances where populations are localized, have not outbred much with other populations, and have adapted to local conditions. And here's just a smattering of some of those. And I would point your direction to Kreb RF in people of Polynesian descent, which was already known to have a patent ascribed to it in synthetic biology without the knowledge of the people whom the variant was discovered. And when asked, the particular researcher said he was doing that in a protective way. But of course, the indigenous people asked him, well, if it was protective, how come you didn't tell us about it? And since then, the relationship between that group and this researcher no longer exists. And then I'd also point your attention to the AS3MT gene variation that's present at lower degrees in East Asia and very high degrees in the Americas. So people of the Andes particularly can metabolize arsenic faster than any population on the planet. And whether or not that is marketable into any kind of pharmaceutic or therapy yet is unknown, but it is a highly desirable target in that regard. And then the thing about genome science or big data in general is that its commercial applicability through the BiDole Act and the America Competes Act actually closes a lot of funding opportunities to people who've done a lot of social determinants research or allostatic load research, and finding ways to protect people in that regard, because social determinants and behavioral research has been shown to be much more capable of explaining health disparity, as well as giving recommendations to correcting health disparity, than genome science ever will. Because a lot of these are imposed by people by themselves or by confrontations and complications between groups. And we saw in the last 7 years, especially, a lot of papers dedicated towards systemic and structural racism here in the United States and how much that contributes to poor health. So the emphasis on these commercially applicable situations is not only blocking better research, but it's also making sure that you do not get services until you end up at the hospital and you're too sick already. So preventative research or preventative healthcare is sort of out the window, which we saw, of course, with COVID and public health. Just to illustrate a point that genetics doesn't run everything, Latinos and American Indians and Alaska Natives share a lot of ancestry. And then Latinos, for the first 2 generations, have a life expectancy 10 years higher than American Indians, Alaska Natives, regardless of that shared ancestry. And they also have a longer lifespan than either American Blacks or American Whites. But of course, Latinos lose that advantage by the 3rd generation and start looking more like other vulnerable populations in the United States, and their lifespan drops. So that would speak to me as not being genetic, but rather a product of structural disadvantage. Not to belabor the point, but this paper also shows a similar trend where Native people on both sides of the Mexican border have roughly the same amount of obesity, which you see in the right graph, but the amount of type 2 diabetes on the US side is 4 to 6 times higher, and then only slightly higher than that of Mexican Native people in Mexico. So again, even though the groups share identical genetic ancestry, the only thing that's different between them is the border. So again, that would speak to some sort of social determinant at work, whether that's access to healthcare, access to healthy food, or just the stress of the environment of living in mostly white population. Something's going on that has nothing to do with genetics. One other thing that's often touted by genome researchers is that all human populations are variations on theme, and that for the most part, differences within a population are greater than differences between populations on average, and that's true. But again, the Americas share a different evolutionary history between ourselves and the rest of the world because we were by ourselves in this place. And there have been several papers that have shown that not only is the frequency of private alleles different, but that there are a number of private alleles that are locally common to the Americas and non-existent in the rest of the world, which again speaks to that treasure chest of genomic variation that other people can exploit, and natives cannot, because natives don't have political voice, they don't have economic voice, and they do not have a corporation that is going to develop any products based on their genome. And there's a lot of other factors that have to do with genetic architecture, like epigenetics, which is intergenerational trauma, admixture, which is very unique in the Americas, where it's almost all sex biased, which would have effects on imprinting mechanisms and epistasis. And then there's, of course, much advertised and known about is the exposome, where a lot of Native people have been victims of environmental racism, where lots of toxic chemicals or other exposures have been dumped into their communities, especially before 1980, because nobody was watching or nobody cared. Going again to this slide, and the next couple of slides, we'll talk about more human failings in culture omics. The Lakota use the phrase "Mitakuye Oyasin," we are all related, which they truly believe that people, rocks, trees, plants, animals, bacteria, whatever, we are all related. We all come from the same source of life here on this planet. And we should all remember that and respect that, and they believe that, but no, there are no tribes in the Americas that are in control of any of this information. And you see this particularly in ancient DNA and the many fights over the years about digging up ancient skeletons in the Americas. And this is just a short list of the many skeletons that have been sequenced by genome sequencing, and either in part or in whole, and the technology is getting much, much better to do whole genome sequences from these old skeletons, as well as doing epigenetic investigations or analysis on these same skeletons. That is a lot of data that can currently circumvent tribal approval processes. Because, as many of you know, especially with the Kennewick skeletons, this was a huge battle between 5 tribes and the scientists in the federal government, where ownership of the skeleton was under debate. I think it was for about 15 years, and the skeleton was kept at the Burke Museum at the UW Seattle during that court battle. And it wasn't until after the genome was sequenced and it was finally put to rest that indeed, not only was Kennewick Man, or the Ancient One, related to Native Americans, but that he was specifically related to the tribes in Washington State. Unfortunately, that data is everywhere now, and it did result into return of the remains to those tribes, but it came at a cost. And this is going to happen more and more often with many skeletons in the Americas, where tribes will be increasingly challenged over their claim and ownership and assertion of sovereign rights over these skeletons, as many people are challenging NAGPRA as we speak, especially after the publication of the partial sequencing of Sitting Bull's genome by Eski Villerslev, who's now at the University of Cambridge, I think, in England. These are the examples I talked about earlier with the Human Genome Diversity Project. As you can see, most of them are in Central and South America, where tribes have no autonomy and no recognized sovereignty, and that data belongs to many other people that are not Native American. And the reason why Latin America in particular is at risk for exploitation is because you see in this graph that there is quite a lot of Native American ancestry left in the fully indigenous people in the middle or the center of this graph. Well, the official number is 11 million, but I think that's fake because it changed so rapidly since about 2000 to the present. I actually think the original number is correct. It's about 40 million Native people in Mexico, a population of about 179 million. But even if that's not true, if you look at all of the admixed or mestizo people, for the most part, in every major state of Mexico, they have high indigenous ancestry, including, if you look on the left, the MXL population are Mexicans from Los Angeles, who are about half or more native, with about 5 to 10% African ancestry. And there have been lots of studies that have already figured out how to remove the African and the European ancestry from these samples and artificially create a Native American genome based on these admixed people. So it's a huge risk, not only to the Native people of Latin America, but also here in Anglo-America of the United States and Canada. And then, of course, the federal government exacerbates this problem by getting involved in determining who is and who isn't Native. It's never been consistent. After the Indian Reorganization Act of the 30s, which allowed a lot of tribal citizens to leave their reservation and made them citizens of the United States. At the same time, legislation was passed to start the termination process for a lot of tribes to get rid of the Indian problem, so-called, which didn't really get reversed until about 1976. Some of those tribes got their land back, some didn't. So that left a lot of people with claims to get their status returned to them, some of them state tribes, and some of them false claims. But in any case, it really puts tribal groups at odds with each other and even at odds with their own understanding of their sovereignty. Some tribes say that their sovereignty stops at the federal edge, meaning that the feds are the ones who determine their sovereignty, not themselves, which to me is antithetical to the definition of sovereignty. One of the other claims is that tribes determine their own membership, but with the case here that I have between the Yaqui, when they got recognized in 1978, and an older tribe like the Eastern Band Cherokee, indeed, Some of these older recognized tribes get carte blanche in enrollment of their citizens by lineal descent or some other system that they decide is proper, whereas the Yaqui aren't allowed to expand their roles past the 1978 original legally submitted role to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So sovereignty not only causes tribes to pit themselves against each other, but also confuses the concept of sovereignty and self-determination, especially in enrollment. And all of this is compounded by direct-to-market DNA investigations and then university or academic investigations of indigeneity. And then we see this in other places around the world where aspirations to whiteness or caste systems, like we see in India or in Mexico, have given the power to give away these resources to people of mixed ancestry who have otherwise been talked out of their indigeneity. They no longer see themselves as indigenous, or if they do, it's only to give away others' resources. We see that very, very apparent right now in Mexico, where for the longest time, people of mixed descent or very little indigenous descent kicking down and abusing their indigenous cousins, only now claiming their indigeneity because they know that it's worth something. It's either worth something biologically, or it's worth something in terms of other resources like culture, song, dance, textiles, rights to sacred spaces like pyramids and that kind of thing. So this is something that's not a cause of indigenous people themselves, but because of a long and tragic history of settler colonialism and aspirational whiteness. And again, going back to tribes in the United States, of course, we see that with the number of applications for federal tribal recognition. And the process doesn't always work as it should, and sometimes it is prone to corruption or other types of executive bias rather than the process that was put into place that the tribes had all agreed upon. And so some tribes naturally have resentment towards tribes that are given recognition without going through the entire process because they feel like it's a political manipulation to actually reduce the amount of say from tribes that have been around longer and have been in confrontation with the federal government. And you're seeing something similar happening in Canada right now with the northeast and eastern states in Canada, where people who don't have indigenous ancestry or have questionable indigenous ancestry trying to claim or get federal recognition so that they can remove the protective water and wildlife and other laws for tribes in the west of Canada. Combining all of this is an Indian Health Service that and oftentimes drops its trust responsibility to its patients. There's a lot of stories like this where people have been seen for years, but because of the way that the IHS is staffed and the way that it functions, people don't get proper follow-up care or notification that there might be a problem. And in this case, this was not very long ago, April 25th, 2022, where this woman found out that she might have a cancerous lesion and that nobody had told her about. And these stories are common, along with a lot of histories of child and sexual abuse. So the system does not work for natives And in such a non-functional or dysfunctional system, there's very little hope or belief in a promise that genome or big data science is going to help improve any sort of standard of care or quality of life in these communities. One thing that's a problem is that I'm a scientist myself, and I believe a lot of scientists have good intentions, and they believe in the rhetoric that they spout, that these technologies are going to be beneficial and change the game for a lot of people. But of course, there's a missing and unfunded phase to research, which is a bridge between collection and analysis of certain kinds of information that would move it towards community benefit. Because basically we have a divided and almost schizophrenic system where we have altruism on the other side, and then we have cutthroat capitalism on the other side, where delivery of implementation or intervention will never come because there is not a market impetus to create that intervention or implementation. So what happens often is that companies profit from this free data that was paid by our public tax dollars, and all of this data becomes the intellectual property of somebody else, because we basically have an invisible and differentially porous membrane from phase 1 to phase 3, meaning that for some populations, the data goes over and no benefits come back, or very little benefits come back, or they come back too many years later. And then for some populations, the benefit's almost immediate. And this describes the same thing in a different way. If you get the analogy here, there's a desert on the left side and there's a wonderful utopia on the other side. The data is inappropriately governed on the tribal side, although there is a great need for implementation and intervention. The data gets moved from the tribal side to the utopic side. And then epidemiologists or other scientists find associations and come up with solutions. But the pebbles in the stream to get the benefit back to tribal locations and communities doesn't exist. There's a lack of real medical education for Indian healthcare. There's a lack of development of pharmacogenomics for Native people. There's a lack of social determinants research for changing diet and behavior. And there's a lack of policy and regulation on both sides of the stream to ensure that tribes get what they deserve. Consented and unconsented data are being paired at increasingly alarming rates, especially after COVID. And there's a lot of researchers that don't want to go back to the way it was. They like the idea of having all of these data sets linked, which is, of course, not just a danger for tribal people, but a danger for all people. Tribes are small populations that need different statistics applied, and also different uses of the data for emergency room and cost planning for hospitals. And there's a huge lack of longitudinal data that would help tribes determine source polluters or those responsible for poor Indian healthcare, so that they can actually go after court battles or lawsuits that would make sure that they get something for being abused or neglected. So we're recommending that most of the data be owned and managed by tribes, either as consortia across regions or tribe by tribe in some sort of data and sample biorepository. This is what I was talking about in terms of small data statistics. There's a process or a idea called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium that isn't really applicable to tribal groups because they're small, and the amount of admixture for some tribes is still new. So people in the population that don't fit into Hardy-Weinberg often don't fit because there was this either incomplete or rather new admixture from outside populations. And those data points or those persons in the data set get thrown out of the data set and create an artificial um, population that is not applicable to the entire population. And this can work in both directions. This could work if the population is rather unadmixed, or if it's mostly admixed and has a small population of people that didn't mix with Europeans or Africans. So a lot of us are calling for better and tailor-made statistics for small populations like tribal groups in the Americas. This is just it's not a good graph, but I'm just trying to demonstrate that if you look at the orange dots towards the bottom right as a mixture of those three populations, for the most part, they're equally mixed among all three populations and are representative enough that you can call them a unique population and not have to throw out a lot of data. But what often happens with native groups is that you have two populations in the same population, and you have to decide which one is the real population. And, you know, as I said, in some of these plots, give me your imagination for a second and say that the top right is the real population and the bottom left is the outliers. There would only be like 3 or 5 people in that outlier population, and those data points would be scrubbed from the data, and then you'd get a false picture of what's actually going on in the population. And this is something that I think for the most part, most scientists and researchers don't understand about tribal populations. So what we did was we created the biorepository for American Indian Capacity Education, Law, and Economy and Technology with help from Stanford and the NIH. The group of terms on the right is from Ruha Benjamin's paper, A Lab of Their Own. And we went further and called it a data bank of their own, a resource of their own, a ability to self-determine and self-sustain their own populations on their own without help from outsiders, which means that they can take this very desirable data, lots of people have a desire for this data, and leverage it towards change, towards money, and towards capacity building in their communities. You might as well strike when the iron's hot, right? And we are called the Native Biodata Consortium. So Bracelet turned into the Native Biodata Consortium. We're the first Indigenous-led, meaning that our board of directors and our scientists, almost all are Indigenous. And then we have the support of the tribe and data repository within a tribal nation's geographic and legal jurisdiction. We are 501c3 nonprofit under tribal and federal law. We have several community board members that's separate from the board of directors, and they're all from Cheyenne River. Research partnerships began in 2009, and we were founded and incorporated in 2019. And as I've been saying, we want to use these samples and data to harness the power of tribal jurisdiction and use sovereign authority to actually compel outsiders to deliver on the promise of that altruistic benefit. So this quote's from the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, which has been in existence for quite a while, I think at least since 2009. We live in an information age. Governments, industries, and organizations of all kinds are claiming a right to gather information on everything from our spending habits to our health records. Data has become a global currency, a valuable asset, and a source of power. Native nations are part of this data revolution, but encounter distinctive obstacles to fully realizing the power of their own data. Why is Indigenous data important? These are 4 key goals. Repatriation of soul and materials, whether that's boarding school remains, whether that's ancient DNA, or whether that's legacy samples that were collected before the Common Rule and the Belmont Report were enforced through informed consent. The use of their own culture, their own beliefs, their own communities' needs to define consent and protect their own data and their bodies from exploitation by outsiders. And there's a lot of examples of research harm for Native American communities that I won't go into right now. Number 3, empower tribal and Native-owned entities to gather and collect the data that serves their own needs, including lawsuits against the government, lobbying the state and federal governments for important policy changes, creating tribal government programs to serve their people. And number 4, empower tribal and Native-owned entities to develop and own intellectual property based on their own data and to grow their own reservation economies. This slide is a nod to the longitudinal data that's missing, but very much needed in Native American communities to talk about past and current differences in health and healthcare, type 2 diabetes, cancer, heart disease. All of those things were not highly prevalent in the past, but they are now, and tribes need to know why. Is that something about behavior? Is it something about their genetics? Is it something about their exposures to water, food, air, and soil? We don't know because we don't have the data. And this is also a nod to the what was mentioned before, the return and repatriation of Indigenous DNA, because believe it or not, there's a lot of it out there still. And we would like to offer our services not only to tribes in the US, Alaska, and Hawaii, but to all Indigenous people everywhere who feel like they have no home for their own data and their own samples, and we will hold them for as long as they would like until they can figure out what needs to be done with them. This is the last or almost last slide. I think that even though there are calls for interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity in biomedical research, it doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen very well. And I think that people in the information technology field and machine learning actually talk about it more and better through semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs and signals. And they've had to do this in the digital space because they're teaching computers how to recognize signs and signals. And it's done for some fields like virology, but for the most part, not done in human biomedicine. But it has to be. It has to be for not only building trust, but it has to be done so that the implementation of benefit happens faster. We have to recognize through semiotics that different signifiers mean things differently across disciplines, that these things mean different things at different times. These things mean different things to different users, meaning race or ethnicity. Not everybody is on the same page with race-based medicine or ethnic-based medicine. And it's up for their own populations to decide the use of that data. And oftentimes it's used in a pejorative manner against minority populations. Different conceptions of the use of data, whether it's cultural, economic, or other kinds of bias. And then we need to look at data through a semiotic lens, which a lot of us minority researchers already do through social justice or goals of equality, which isn't done enough in my opinion. And I think that people in political science, people in game theory, people in the information technology field often think about this, and not enough of these biomedical researchers do, where we try as often as possible to create a win-win or a win-win-win game. instead of trying to create what often happens is a zero-sum game. And then sometimes, as we're seeing quite often now in the US politics, is a negative sum game where everybody loses. So we have to do all of this better. We have to think outside the box because the technologies we have are very, very powerful. And without thinking in some of these new ways and taking this powerful data and wedging it into the 1970 ways of doing things, we're going to hurt a lot of people. So I thank you for your attention. We are the Native Biodata Consortium, and there's our web address there at the bottom. And I thank you for paying attention to me.